Ayo was a bright and kind-hearted girl, loved by all who knew her. She had inherited her late mother's gift for healing, a skill that had saved many lives in the village. People often came to her for advice, trusting her knowledge of herbs and remedies. But after her mother's passing, everything changed. Her father, grief-stricken and lonely, remarried a woman named Dahlia. At first, Dahlia seemed kind, but once she settled into their home, her true nature was revealed. She treated Ayo with coldness, seeing her as nothing more than an unwanted burden. Along with Dahlia came her daughter, Nia, a girl as spoiled as she was cruel. Unlike Ayo, Nia had no interest in learning the ways of healing or helping others. She only cared about beauty, wealth, and admiration. But what frustrated her most was how much the villagers respected Ayo. While Nia spent her days lounging and gossiping, Ayo worked hard, tending to the sick, gathering herbs, and listening to the elders' wisdom. No matter how much Nia tried to make fun of her, people still admired Ayo. It burned her with jealousy. Dahlia and Nia made sure Ayo's life became miserable. They forced her to do all the housework, forbidding her from practicing her healing. They laughed at her, calling her the little witch behind her back. Her father, once a strong man, had become weak under Dahlia's control. He still loved Ayo, but he was too blind to see how badly she was treated. And so, Ayo suffered in silence, never complaining, never fighting back. But fate had a cruel twist in store, one that would change Ayo's life forever. One morning, Ayo woke up to the sound of her father coughing violently. His skin was burning with fever, and he could barely lift his head. She rushed to his side, her heart pounding with fear. She had seen illnesses like this before, and she knew exactly which herbs could save him. But before she could act, Dahlia stepped in, her eyes filled with hatred. "You will not touch him," Dahlia snapped, pushing Ayo away. "This is your doing. You brought this sickness upon him with your witchcraft." Ayo gasped. "No, I can help him. Please, just let me." "Enough," Dahlia shouted, turning to the villagers who had gathered outside their hut. "You have all seen it. Ever since this girl was born, strange things have happened. She speaks to the wind. She walks with the spirits. And now, she has cursed her own father." The villagers murmured in fear. They had always admired Ayo's wisdom, but deep down, they feared what they did not understand. Ayo tried to protest, but Nia stepped forward, pretending to cry. "She scares me," Nia sobbed. "She looks at people, and bad things happen. What if she curses the rest of us too?" That was all it took. The fear in the villagers' eyes turned into anger. Someone whispered, "She must be cast out." And soon, the whispers became a chant. The chief arrived, his face grim. He looked at Ayo's father, shaking his head. "We cannot take risks," he said. "If Ayo truly has magic, she must leave before she brings more harm." Tears filled Ayo's eyes as she turned to her father. He tried to speak, but he was too weak to fight for her. Dahlia smirked. Nia stood beside her, her face glowing with victory. Before she could say another word, the guards grabbed Ayo by the arms and dragged her away. The villagers turned their backs on her. No one defended her. No one believed in her. At the edge of the forest, the guards threw her down. "You may never return," one of them said. "If you do, you will face death." As they left, Ayo sat in the dirt, shaking. The forest before her was dark and filled with dangers, wild animals, poisonous plants, and spirits that no one dared to speak of. She turned back, hoping for one last glance at the home she had lost. But all she saw was Nia and Dahlia laughing in the distance. They had won. Ayo was gone, and now they had everything. Ayo wandered into the dark forest, her heart pounding with fear. The trees were so tall that they blocked out the sun, making everything feel cold and unwelcoming. The wind howled through the branches like a whispering spirit, and the sounds of unseen creatures echoed all around her. She had no food, no shelter, and no idea how she would survive. But she knew one thing: going back was not an option. Night fell quickly, and the forest came alive with danger. Glowing eyes watched her from the shadows, and strange cries filled the air. Ayo pressed herself against a tree, trying to stay hidden. Suddenly she heard rustling in the bushes. A giant serpent slithered out, its golden eyes locking onto her. It hissed, its forked tongue flickering in the moonlight. Ayo held her breath, too scared to move. Just as the snake lunged, a gust of wind swept through the trees, knocking her aside and sending the serpent slithering back into the darkness. She didn't understand how, but it felt as if something, or someone, was protecting her. The next few days were a blur of hunger and exhaustion. Ayo ate wild berries when she could find them, but her body grew weaker. She walked until her feet bled, her vision blurry from thirst. One night, as she lay beneath a massive baobab tree, she heard voices whispering in the wind. They spoke in a language she didn't understand, but their tone was gentle, almost guiding her. She forced herself to stand and followed the whispers, stumbling deeper into the unknown. Then, just when she thought she would collapse, she saw it, a village hidden within the heart of the forest. The huts were built from ancient wood, their roofs covered in vines. A soft golden light glowed from inside them, and the air smelled of herbs and incense. As she stepped forward, an old woman with deep brown skin and wise, piercing eyes emerged from one of the huts. She carried a staff, and her presence was both powerful and comforting. "I have been waiting for you, child," the woman said, her voice as steady as the earth. Ayo fell to her knees. "Who are you?" she whispered. "I am Mama Tembo, the last healer of the ancestors," the woman replied. "And you, Ayo, are meant for more than you know." Under Mama Tembo's guidance, Ayo learned secrets of healing that no one in her village had ever known. She discovered that the whispers in the wind were the voices of her ancestors, calling her to her true purpose. She learned to listen to the earth, to feel the energy of the trees, and to call upon the spirits of nature. With a single touch, she could ease pain. With a word, she could summon the wind. The girl who had once been cast out as a cursed outcast was now something far greater. Ayo was no longer just a healer. She was power itself. Far away from the dark forest where Ayo had found her new life, the village that had cast her out was now drowning in fear and suffering. A terrible plague had come without warning. It started with a few people complaining of headaches and dizziness, but within days, the sickness spread like wildfire. The villagers burned herbs and prayed to the gods, but nothing stopped it. People collapsed in the streets, their bodies burning with fever. Some lost their sight, their eyes turning cloudy and lifeless. Others could no longer move, their limbs stiff as stone. Panic filled the air. The healers tried everything, boiling roots, crushing leaves, mixing potions, but no remedy worked. The disease was unstoppable. Then, the unthinkable happened. The chief's only son, a strong and proud young man, fell ill. His skin turned pale, his body shivered violently, and he could no longer speak. The chief, a man who had once stood tall with pride, now knelt beside his son, begging the gods for mercy. But the gods remained silent. Soon, even Dahlia and Nia were not spared. Dahlia, who had once walked through the village with power and arrogance, now lay weak on a straw mat, her body covered in sweat. Nia, the girl who had laughed when Ayo was exiled, now trembled with fear as her vision faded into darkness. Desperation spread like the disease itself. The villagers, who had once feared and rejected Ayo's healing, now realized the truth. She was the only one who could save them, but she was gone, lost in the forbidden forest where no one dared to go. And now, with death creeping closer, they had no choice. Someone had to find Ayo. Someone had to beg for her mercy. The village was in chaos. The plague had taken too many lives, and the healers had failed. There was only one name left on everyone's lips: Ayo, the same girl they had cast out, the same girl they had accused of witchcraft. Now, she was their only hope. The chief, his face lined with worry, called for a messenger. "Find Ayo," he ordered. "Beg her to return. If she refuses, we are all doomed." The messenger, a man named Jumo, hesitated. The forest was a place of death, filled with wild beasts and spirits, but he had no choice. With nothing but a spear and a small pouch of food, he set off into the forbidden land. Days passed. Jumo fought through thick vines, crossed dangerous rivers, and avoided the glowing eyes of night creatures. The forest whispered around him, the wind carrying voices he did not understand. Just as he was about to give up, he saw it, a hidden village, glowing softly in the moonlight, and standing in the center was Ayo. She looked nothing like the girl they had cast out. She stood tall, her once simple clothes now woven with symbols of power. A staff carved with ancient markings rested in her hand. She no longer looked like a helpless girl. She looked like someone who had become one with the spirits. Jumo fell to his knees. "Ayo," he pleaded. "The village is dying. The chief's son is near death. Dahlia and Nia," he hesitated, ashamed of what he was about to say. "They are sick too. They need you." Ayo's face remained calm, unreadable. "And what of the chief?" she asked. "What of the people who called me a witch? What of the woman and girl who laughed when I was exiled?" Jumo lowered his head. "They beg for mercy." Ayo's heart was steady, but inside she felt the weight of her past. The village that had thrown her away now crawled at her feet. The same hands that had pushed her into darkness were now reaching out for her light. She closed her eyes. The spirits whispered around her. The choice was hers to make. Ayo stood at the gates of the village, the place that had once been her home. It was quiet now, with the villagers waiting in the distance, unsure of what to expect from her. She could hear the faint sound of footsteps behind her, the desperate cries for help from Dahlia and Nia, the same voices that had mocked her, now pleading for salvation. But as she stood there, a strange feeling washed over her. The air grew thick with energy, and the wind began to swirl around her like it had a life of its own. A deep, echoing voice spoke from the shadows, and Ayo froze. "They cast you out. They betrayed you," the voices of her ancestors whispered in unison. "Will you heal them or leave them to their fate?" Ayo's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the weight of the question pressing on her, the memory of everything she had endured, her exile into the forest, the hunger that gnawed at her, the nights she spent alone, fighting for survival, rushed back to her in a flood. She could still hear the cruel laughter of Dahlia and Naya, the way they had treated her like dirt, like nothing. Now, they were begging for her help. The people who had abandoned her, who had called her a witch, were now pleading for mercy, and the power to save them was in her hands. She thought of the pain, the humiliation, and the suffering she had faced. She could leave them to suffer, to feel the same helplessness she had felt all those months ago. They had betrayed her once, and she could let them pay for it. But then she remembered the lessons Mama Tembo had taught her. Healing wasn't just about curing sickness. It was about restoring balance. It was about bringing peace, even to those who didn't deserve it. The spirits had given her this power for a reason. But would she use it to hurt those who had hurt her? Or would she rise above the pain and be the healer she was meant to be? Ayo stood there for what felt like an eternity, the voices of the ancestors swirling around her like the wind. She was no longer the powerless girl who had been cast out. Now, she had the power to shape her own destiny. The choice was hers. Would she be a vessel of revenge, or would she be a beacon of healing? Ayo stood tall at the gates of the village, her eyes scanning the scene before her. The villagers, once so cruel, now knelt on the ground, their faces twisted in fear and desperation. Dahlia and Nia, once the source of her torment, were in front of her, begging with tear-filled eyes. They were weak, pale from the disease, their bodies trembling. The village had cast her aside, turned their backs on her, and accused her of being a witch. Now they were powerless, pleading for her help. She remembered it all, the harsh words, the punishment, the loneliness. She could still feel the sting of their betrayal. How Dahlia had never let her use her healing skills. How Nia had mocked her for being different. They had pushed her into that deadly forest to die, but instead she had risen stronger than they could ever imagine. Now they were at her feet, just as powerless as they had made her feel. The choice before her was tempting. She could walk away and leave them to suffer, to feel the same pain she had endured. She could let them face the wrath of the gods and the plague that was destroying them. The thought of revenge, of watching them beg for mercy, stirred something inside her. After all, they had caused her so much misery. They had stripped her of everything. But then, a calmness washed over her. Ayo remembered the lessons of the forest, the wisdom of Mama Tembo. She was no longer the girl who had been exiled. She was a healer, a protector. She had the power to save, to heal, but also to show mercy. Ayo's voice broke the silence, steady and clear. "I will heal you," she said, her words holding power. "But you will never have power over me again. You will never again control my life or my fate." The villagers stood still, shocked at her decision. Dahlia and Nia gasped, realizing that Ayo could have chosen to leave them to die. But instead, she had chosen forgiveness. The weight of her words was heavy, and they understood the depth of what she was offering. Life, but at a price. Ayo stepped forward, her hands glowing with the ancient magic she had learned. As she knelt to heal Dahlia and Nia, the village held its breath, knowing that with a single word, she could have ended it all. But instead, she chose to heal, and in doing so, she made her own peace, showing the true power of forgiveness. After Ayo made her decision, she moved with purpose, her hands glowing with the ancient magic of her ancestors. She bent down to touch the sick villagers, one by one, her healing energy flowing through them like a warm breeze. The village that had once turned its back on her now watched in awe as the disease lifted, as if it were nothing more than a bad dream. People slowly started to rise, their fevers cooling, their strength returning. The chief's son opened his eyes, the darkness lifting from his sight. Even Dahlia and Nia, once the source of her pain, were now recovering, their faces filled with relief and gratitude. But as she healed them, Ao knew that the time for true justice had come. She could not simply forget what they had done to her. She had chosen mercy, yes, but there were consequences for betrayal. With a final breath of power, Ao whispered a spell, a quiet but powerful incantation that only Dahlia and Nia could hear. Nia, who had once spread cruel lies about her, screamed as her throat tightened. The words she had used to hurt Ao, the lies that had poisoned her reputation, now vanished. She could no longer speak, her voice taken away forever. The village could hear her, but only silence came from her lips. Nia would never again be able to spread deceit, to twist the truth with her words. Dahlia, too, felt the weight of Ao's power. Once a proud woman, she was now reduced to nothing. Her hands trembled as she tried to stand, but her strength failed her. The magic that flowed through Ao's hands had humbled her completely. She, who had once treated Ao like dirt, was now forced to serve the girl she had once abused. From that moment on, Dahlia would be Ao's servant, bowing to the very girl she had tried to destroy. As Ao rose to her feet, the villagers stood in awe, their mouths open in shock and wonder. They knew they had witnessed something incredible. This girl, the one they had once exiled, had saved them, and now they saw her for who she truly was. Not just a healer, but a force of nature. With one last act of magic, Ao had restored the balance, and the village understood it. They knew they had wronged her, and now they would honor her. In a grand ceremony, the villagers crowned Ao as their new healer, placing a necklace of golden beads around her neck. They praised her, calling her the daughter of the ancestors, the one who had brought life back to their dying village. Ao, once rejected, now stood at the heart of it all, a symbol of power, wisdom, and mercy. The village that had abandoned her now celebrated her as their savior. Ao stood alone beneath the towering baobab tree, its thick roots stretching deep into the earth, its branches reaching high into the sky. This tree had always been sacred, a symbol of strength and wisdom in the village. As she stood there, a sense of peace and power washed over her. The wind rustled the leaves above, and it felt as though the very air was alive with energy. Ao closed her eyes, feeling a connection to the ancestors, to the spirits that had guided her throughout her journey. She had come so far, from being an outcast to becoming the healer and protector of her people. Suddenly the wind seemed to speak, its whispers soft but clear. "You have passed the test. The balance is restored," the voices of the ancestors murmured, their words echoing in the stillness of the moment. Ao's heart swelled with emotion. She had endured so much, faced betrayal and hardship, but she had never given up. Now, standing under the baobab tree, she understood. This was her moment. The spirits had recognized her strength, her resilience, and her ability to heal, not just with magic, but with her heart. Ao's journey had not been just about survival. It had been about transformation. She was no longer the helpless girl who had been cast out. She had embraced her destiny, learned to forgive, and shown mercy even when it seemed impossible. She had chosen to heal, not just the village, but herself. And now, she had become something more than she ever imagined, a legend. As the wind whispered again, Ao felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had done more than restore balance to the village. She had restored balance to her own soul. The past, with all its pain, had led her to this moment, and now she was free. Free from the shadows of her past, free from the cruelty of Dahlia and Nia, free from the village's judgment. Ao stood tall, her eyes shining with newfound wisdom. She was not just a healer. She was the embodiment of strength, forgiveness, and destiny. And as the wind continued to swirl around her, Ao knew that her story was only beginning. The village had learned its lesson, and the world would know her name. She was no longer a victim. She was a legend, a force of nature, destined to change the world. As the story reached its final moment, the storyteller's voice grew solemn, carrying the weight of the lesson. Never betray the one who holds your fate in their hands, for destiny sees all, the storyteller warned, his words ringing out in the quiet of the evening. It was a truth that had been lived by Ao, a truth that had been learned through pain and perseverance. The betrayal she had faced, the hardship she had endured, had been a test of strength, character, and the power of forgiveness. And in the end, Io had proven herself not just to the village, but to the very forces of destiny itself. The story shifted to its final image. Io, standing tall, her head held high with pride and wisdom. She was no longer the vulnerable girl cast aside. She was a woman of power and purpose. Before her, Dahlia and Nia, once the source of her suffering, now bowed low, humbled by the weight of their actions. They had no choice but to kneel before the girl they had once tried to destroy, for they knew that she had risen above them in ways they could never understand. Ao had shown them mercy, but she had also made them pay the price for their cruelty. Behind her, the village stood in awe, their voices lifting in praise as they celebrated Ayo's return. She had saved them, healed them, and most importantly, she had taught them the value of respect and humility. The village that had once cast her out now hailed her as their savior, acknowledging the strength she had shown and the wisdom she had gained. The final image was one of triumph, not just for Ayo, but for the lesson she had imparted, that fate is always watching, and those who do wrong will eventually face the consequences of their actions. Ayo's journey had been one of pain, but it was also one of growth and redemption. And in that moment, as the village celebrated her, it was clear that her destiny had been fulfilled. She had become a legend, not just in the eyes of her people, but in the eyes of the world.